So welcome to those who are joining us. I'd just like everyone on the call to know this is being recorded. And I would like everyone to keep themselves muted unless they want to speak. And feel free to raise your hand if you want to have a question or put it in the chat box. Yes, we're hoping to stimulate quite a bit of discussion from the people that are joining us.
Great.
And the municipality that I live in is Hanover, which has the highest hogs per hectare in Western Canada. One of the reasons why I'm motivated to be active with Hog Watch, currently serving as the secretary, along with Vicki. And we're volunteer-led and donation-driven. Thank you very much to the folks that have made donations that have allowed this webinar to take place. This is the first webinar that Hog Watch has hosted, and it's being paid for by donations. So folks who want to support the maintenance of Hog Watch that helps us keep our eyes on what's going on and alerting folks and trying to support folks who are being challenged by the industrial nature of hog production in Manitoba. So it's just after 7 now. I'm still admitting folks and probably will admit folks for the first little bit. Welcome you all to the first of 3 Hog Watch webinars. My name is Janine Gibson. I've worked as an organic verification officer across Canada and North America for the last 28 years and serve as one of the directors of Hog Watch Manitoba. I will be co-hosting this event with Vicki Burns. Vicki, would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, thank you, Janine, and welcome to everybody. It's really great to see so many people who are interested in this. I'm one of the directors of Hog Watch Manitoba, and just to let everybody know that we're a volunteer group, environmentalists, animal welfare people, farmers, just concerned citizens, scientists. What we are trying to do is promote a hog industry in Manitoba that we consider to be ethically, environmentally, and economically sustainable. So we're not opposed to raising pigs, but we really believe there's a right way, and what's happening primarily in Manitoba is not the right way. Now, I would like to acknowledge that today I'm joining you from Treaty 1 territory, the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, and Dakota peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Before we start with the speakers who are going to be giving us lots of information tonight, I just want to make the point that we will have a question and answer period after the speakers. And so if you can just make note of what questions you have, or even write your questions down and put them in the chat right now, in case you're afraid of forgetting them, that would be great. It's just that we don't want to interrupt the flow of the speakers. So we're going to start with Dr. Jan Hajek, who's an infectious disease specialist at Vancouver General Hospital and a clinical assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. In 2014, he actually worked with the World Health Organization in West Africa to respond to the Ebola outbreak. And this year, he's been working on the COVID ward at Vancouver General Hospital. So I think we're extremely lucky to have Jan willing to spend some time with us when he's obviously doing such crucial work right now in many areas. So I'll hand it over to you right now, Jan, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you very much, Vicki and Janine, for the excellent introduction. That was very nice. So, you know, I'm glad you could all join, and I'm happy to talk about this topic. It is an important topic. So I'm generally going to talk about antibiotic resistance. I'm going to, you know, we're taught here before lectures to talk about disclosures. So I don't have any financial disclosures. And to let you know, I'm a clinical infectious disease doctor. So my specialty is dealing with humans with infections. I'm not a veterinarian, so I'm not an expert in care for animals, and I'm not involved in farming. As a teenager, I worked on a small farm, but just for a short period of time. So outlined with the presentation. So what I want to talk about was one, just a general introduction of antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. Most of you already know some of this, but I think it's useful just to kind of go over it again to highlight what antibiotics are and how resistance happens. And then some examples of how antibiotic uses on farms affect people. And these are ones that as physicians we know about. There are probably other ones that are more that the farming community may know more about, but these are the ones that highlight how impact of antibiotic resistance or antibiotic use on farms affects humans. And then to mention Canadian farming practices, and specifically things that I was aware of from Health Canada perspective. And then a closing kind of take-home message slide. So this is the first one, just about antibiotics in general. So antibiotics, as many of you probably know, that they were discovered kind of surreptitiously or by accident by Fleming in 1928. He was studying bacteria on petri dishes, and somehow mold, maybe an open window or somehow, got onto the petri dishes, and the mold started killing the bacteria next to it. And he isolated this juice from the mold juice, and then later on they discovered that mold was producing some kind of chemical and they called it penicillin. And then they refined the penicillin, kind of isolated it, and they started using it mainly in about the 1940s, and it saved countless lives, millions of lives. Before, people would die of things like pneumonia or skin infections. The death rate in World War I was huge from bacterial infections, and those just reduced dramatically in the 1940s after penicillin was used. When Fleming was awarded this Nobel Prize for this life-changing discovery, but he also recognized that antibiotic resistance can occur. So right away, as they discovered it, he said, be very careful that it's not hard to make these microbes or these bacteria resistant to penicillin in the laboratory by exposing them, especially by exposing them to low concentrations. And he warned that that's something that could come if they're not used appropriately, if they're not conserved or used just for when we need them. And I'm going to show you, this is a 2-minute video, and I think it illustrates very nicely how this antibiotic resistance happens in a petri dish. It's from Harvard University, so it's kind of reputable, and so I'm just going to I think you can hear it as it goes through. There are 9
bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, porous and thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. Then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
Okay. I think that's such a nice visual show of how antibiotic resistance happens. So we knew how antibiotic resistance happens. Unfortunately, around the same time as Fleming discovered antibiotic uses for therapeutic reasons, it was also discovered that they could work as growth promotion. So to increase efficiency of animals' growth, and it's not exactly clear how it works, but it seems that when you give trace or small amounts of antibiotics to animals, they seem to grow faster. And so this was used in farming to make it more efficient, more intensive. One of it was for growth promotion, and also for kind of to make it more efficient to treat. You can imagine for these huge farms, it's hard, I think, for farmers to identify which animal is sick or not. And so in a matter of efficiency, just giving a little bit of antibiotic to everybody seems to be, it might help with this efficiency and industrialization. But it had some downsides. And another example back in 1976, that this was a study of a farm, and one of the researchers, Levy, took a farm. So that's a picture from 1928. There were color pictures in the 70s, but I couldn't find one then. And so there's a chicken farm. They took samples of the chickens and the people on the farm first, and then they added tetracycline, an antibiotic, to the chickens on the farm, just to the chickens. And then they studied what happens to the chickens and what happens to the people. And so you can see at the beginning here, the amount of antibiotic resistance on the farm in the chickens in white, the people on the farm in black, and the kind of diagonal marks, the neighbors, very, very little rates of antibiotic resistance, which would be expected. Over time, in 2 days' time, about 30% of chickens had resistant bacteria in their stool. Still, people were okay. But after 6 months, about 30% or 25% or so of people started getting tetracycline-resistant bacteria in their stool, and most of the chickens. And so this was an example where, it was clear that giving chickens antibiotics increases the rates of antibiotic resistance. This was recognized too in 1969 in the UK. There were rates of resistant salmonella infections, both in cows on farms and in people. And the UK commissioned a report and said, we should really stop this. We have to stop this use of antibiotic in healthy animals to promote growth and to prevent infections. And they thought that, these are largely unnecessary hazards, and we should not allow them to continue. Unfortunately, now I'm going to switch from that understanding to what we are doing. And this is a story from the ceftiofur. And ceftiofur is an antibiotic that's used in animals, and it's very closely related to one of the most commonly used antibiotics for sick people in hospitals, ceftriaxone. And so this is quite a serious disease, I think, in chickens. It's kind of an umbilical cord type infection. It's often caused by a bacteria called E. coli. Risk factors include things like poor hygienic conditions and humidity. So as farmers work hard to kind of balance the conditions in the farms, but also some farmers routinely inject this antibiotic into the eggs just to try to prevent this infection from happening. And then, unfortunately, what happened is in 2004, they saw that lots of chickens, actually the meat in chickens, they didn't test the chicken itself, but they had access to meat in stores. And the meat in stores, 60% of them contained drug-resistant strains of salmonella. And they found that in people, they started also getting infections with ceftriaxone-resistant salmonella. And so the industry by themselves decided, okay, this doesn't look good, or this isn't good, I should say, and suspended the use of ceftiofur. With that, you can see the resistance went down. Unfortunately, it increased again after that voluntary suspension, and you can see that rates of ceftiofur use, 31% of farms started using it on their farms, and the rates of resistance, both on chicken meat and in people, started increasing. A clear example, I think, of how antibiotic use on farms leads to antibiotic resistance on the animals, in the meat, and in humans. And this antibiotic resistance is increasing in humans. This is that ceftiofur, ceftriaxone. It's increasing. These are numbers from US, estimating that it's leading to many deaths and leading to a high cost for the medical system, or healthcare costs. And antibiotic resistance, it's widely recognized, WHO, UN, Health Canada. Most people say this is one of the most significant threats to public health, that already many people are dying of antibiotic resistance. And there's concern that we may go back to that pre-antibiotic era if we lose these antibiotics. And people have said this is kind of like the medical version of global warming and the climate crisis. That's something that we really have to take seriously. Now, in hospital, I talked about salmonella a little bit. I'm just going to mention that it's not often salmonella infections that we see in hospital. Most of them are things like E. coli or Staph aureus. And in my work, most of the types of infections I see are two types of kind of drug-resistant infections. That one is people who have gotten extremely drug-resistant bacteria because of repeated use of treatments in hospital. So they come in with a normal kind of bacteria, but they have some chronic lung disease and they keep getting infection after infection and hospital-acquired very drug-resistant bacteria. And they're resistant to most of our antibiotics, and we try these like extra kind of last resort antibiotics or combinations of ineffective antibiotics in hopes that they'll work. The other example I have is that sometimes there's a young woman who comes in with a urinary tract infection. She's relatively well and has a drug-resistant organism. And where does that come from? And so this is an example. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a woman that came in. She had burning with urination and fevers. We sent the urine for culture, and we found that it was resistant to the typical antibiotics. Ampicillin resistant, ceftriaxone, like Ceftiofur, resistant, Septra resistant, Cipro resistant, gentamicin resistant, tetracycline resistant. Those are all our oral antibiotics. So we're out of oral antibiotics. We have two types of IV antibiotics. One group works, it's like a third line antibiotic, and the second group works too, but it has some side effects. So this healthy woman had no oral antibiotics, and she had to come kind of daily to the emergency department for IV antibiotics. And that's not rare, it happens. And where this infection comes from, so there is some evidence that some of these strains of resistant bacteria that are causing urinary tract infections do come from meat and from animals. And so this is kind of the example where there's an animal on a farm. They're given antibiotics to prevent infections or promote growth. And then they, as we saw from the Levy experiment, they get bacteria on them that are resistant to those antibiotics. Then if they come onto people, these people are now colonized with the same kind of resistant bacteria that those animals had. And if they get an infection, like a urinary tract infection, appendicitis, pneumonia, it can be one of these resistant infections. So it's not to say every urinary tract infection is a foodborne thing, but there are some E. coli that have come from animals onto humans and led to drug-resistant infections. The last kind of story is this kind of antibiotic of last resort story. That when I said, those people who have severely resistant bacteria were looking for something to use, we use this kind of drug, colistin. We've not used it much at all. It was discovered a long time ago, but because of its side effects, we tend not to use it. And because we don't use it, it tends to be susceptible. It tends to be something that we can rely on to use if we need it. It's kind of like in our back pocket. Unfortunately, it's also cheap, and it's been used in the hog industry and other industries. And this was a story in 2015 in China, where they have also big farms. They found that they're finding a lot of this resistance of this colistin and on these plasmids, where they can go from bacteria to bacteria. And this resistance to colistin is now spreading globally. And that's a big threat for us, because that was our kind of reserve antibiotic. So we really don't like to see resistance to that. Now, last thing, so that was the background for resistance. And now how are we doing here? So our antibiotic use in Canada, 80% of all our antibiotics are used on farms for farm animals. And per kilogram of meat from human meat or human to animal, we use more antibiotics per kilogram on animals than in people. And most of the antibiotics we're using on animals is for things like growth promotion, growth prevention, for healthy animals, not for animals that are sick. And a last example here is, if you look at this is from our Canadian surveillance. So our surveillance is not perfect on farms, but here there's an example of 97 farms for pigs and about 141 for chickens. And the red is antibiotics used for growth promotion. The green is antibiotic use for prevention, and the blue is treatment. And you can see that at those 97 pig farms, most of the antibiotic that's being used is to promote growth or to prevent infections, giving the antibiotics to healthy pigs. And chickens, it's somewhat similar. And then so just our response to these antibiotic use. So in 2002, Health Canada, there was an advisory committee made by physicians as well, infectious disease doctors and public health people. And we raised alarms saying that, right now there's no quite system to monitor the antibiotic use on farms. We don't know. In human health, we are very careful of trying to use our antibiotics judiciously. And in farms, it's hard to kind of regulate it. And there was an own use policy in place where a farm could import any antibiotic they want from anywhere in the world, including non-Health Canada approved antibiotics, and use it on their farms. And that went unaddressed up until about 2017, when the federal plan through Health Canada closed this policy for own use. And now every medically important antibiotic has to be prescribed by a veterinarian, and they've recommended to stop using, or they said that you have to stop using medically important antibiotics for growth promotion. It's still, prevention is still there, but there are moves now to address this issue of antibiotic use and antibiotic resistance on farms. So just to close, I think that I'd like to impress upon you that antibiotic resistance is a very serious, it's one of the most significant threats to public health. And these are kind of slides from the WHO. And what they're recommending is for us to stop using antibiotics in healthy animals to prevent the spread of antibiotic resistance. That it does foster antibiotic resistance on farms, and it leads to antibiotic resistance in people. And that the amount of antibiotics we have is limited. And if we want to preserve, they're only around since 1940. They haven't been around for so long. And so if we want to keep them going for a longer period of time, we have to be careful with how we use them. And with that, I'm going to close. And I said a lot. And so I hope there's some questions, or if you didn't catch anything, then to let me know, and we can kind of talk about it more.
Okay, thank you so much, Jan. That's really, really important information you're providing, and I'm sure there will be questions. And before I hand it over to Janine to introduce our next speaker, I just want to make the point that after we hear from both speakers, we'll be filling in a little bit more information about what is happening here in Manitoba regarding antibiotic use in the hog industry and what we can or cannot find out about it. So I really appreciate all the information that you've brought forward. I'm going to hand this over now to Janine, who will introduce our next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Vicki. There are some questions in the chat, and I just want to say that most of the antibiotics that are administered, what we call prophylactically, to boost growth and to prevent infection, is administered through the feed. So this is not hog barn owners giving needles to their animals, but it's being fed, it's being mixed right in with their feed. And so I hope, yes, I see Lynn is back with us. Lynn Kavanagh has worked with World Animal Protection, and I was very pleased that she contacted me in Hogwatch Manitoba to do some research for a very interesting program that she's going to share with us now. So please give us any background of yourself that you feel comfortable sharing, Lynn. But I just want to thank you very much for joining us and for your interest in what's happening in terms of AMR resistance in Manitoba and for the work that you're doing. So please unmute yourself and let's start with your presentation. Welcome, Lynn. So glad you could be with us.
Thank you, Janine, and thanks to you as well, Vicki, for inviting me to talk about this, to present on this topic. I'll share my screen. So as Janine said, I'm the farming campaign manager with World Animal Protection. I've been working there since 2013, and I will, in my presentation, give a little background about the organization. So here I go, share screen. So yes, I'm going to talk about the issue of antibiotic use and resistance on in industrial animal agriculture. So just a little quickie about World Animal Protection. We're a global animal welfare organization with offices in 14 countries. And we have 2 campaign areas that we work on. And we've just rolled out or are just launching our new 10-year strategy for these areas, wildlife and farming. So on the wildlife side, our goal is to protect wildlife habitats so that wild animals can be wild, and to work to end the exploitation of wildlife used in entertainment, the pet trade, and traditional medicine. Obviously, it's more involved than that. I'll just give you the top line overview to let you know that that's one area that we work on. And then on our farming work, we work to end factory farming and to transform the food system to one that is humane and sustainable. In the past, we worked on specific animal welfare issues, making advocacy efforts to end what we would consider the most egregious or the worst practices of the industrial animal agriculture system, such as gestation crates for breeding sows or mother pigs, battery cages for laying hens, long distance transport, and other issues. And we'll continue through our new food system and farming campaign to work on improving the welfare conditions of farm animals, but we also are taking a systemic approach because we recognize the interconnectedness of the issues that industrial animal agriculture also has impacts on health and environment as well as animals. And animal industrial ag is the biggest animal welfare problem globally, and it's a major driver of some of the world's most pressing issues like climate change, loss of biodiversity, pollution, increased pandemic risk. And so looking at it from that lens, we see that it's really important to take this holistic approach to have a long-term benefit for animals, but also for the environment and humans. So we're advocating in our new approach a reduced consumption of animal foods and consuming more plant-based foods. And I'll talk a little bit about what we want to see at the end of the presentation. Higher welfare farming systems, and then a ban on the prophylactic use of antibiotics. So there's over 50 billion animals in factory farms right now. So, farming so many animals can only happen when their needs and their welfare are compromised. The goal in industrial agriculture is to get animals to slaughter as quickly as possible to produce the most animals in the shortest amount of time. And keeping animals in these low welfare conditions, like crowded in confinement or in cages and barren conditions, cause frustration, cause stress, cause pain. Subjecting them to painful procedures puts them at risk for illness and infections. And so antibiotics are a Band-Aid solution for poor welfare practices. Okay, so hence, although the overuse of antibiotics is an important public health issue, it's also very much linked to how animals on farms are treated, which is why we're focused on this issue as in the work that we do. Pig farms use very high levels of antibiotics because pigs are one of the most intensively farmed animals on the planet. And as I mentioned, their antibiotic use is associated with certain practices on farms, such as tail docking and castration, as well as early weaning of piglets, which makes them more vulnerable to infection. Focusing on antibiotics is also an example of what we could call a broken food system. It's really symbolic. Factory farming is both a symptom of the high demand for animal protein, but is also a major contributor to some of the world's most pressing problems, as I mentioned, biodiversity loss, climate change, and the emergence of new pandemics. The International Panel on Climate Change says that without drastic changes to land use, agriculture, and human diets, we will not meet our target to keep the Earth's temperature below 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. And they recommend globally reducing the amount of meat that is consumed. And another recent report, and there have been many talking about these issues, it seems, lately. Another recent report by the United Nations Environment Program says agriculture intensification is responsible for over 50% of infectious diseases in animals since 1940. Another reason is that the antibiotic issue is the antibiotic resistance issue is very compelling. People are interested and concerned about antibiotic resistance because it potentially impacts their own health. And so it's a way to engage people on the bigger issues of intensive agriculture, how that contributes to antibiotic resistance, and then also to dialogue how that's connected to the poor treatment of animals on farms. And then lastly is the One Health, One Welfare approach. And this is a relatively new concept that emerged from what's called the One Health concept. And it's emphasizing the connection between animal welfare, human well-being, conservation, and the environment. So the way we treat animals both impacts them and us through these public health and environmental issues that I'm talking about. And again, another report from the UK-based Chatham House that just also came out recently said the global food system is accelerating biodiversity loss and puts us at risk for zoonotic diseases. So this next slide is just a really nice graphic of showing that One Health, One Welfare approach when it comes to antimicrobial resistance. So, the large amount of antibiotics that are used on intensive agriculture operations, and with the way the system is set up, that there's large amounts of animals in a small space, means that it facilitates the spread of these potentially resistant bacteria or antibiotic resistant genes. And then when they are eliminated through the animal's feces, that could get into public waterways or into the drinking water or spread on crops, that's another mechanism by which they can reach humans. And then of course, when they're in humans, they can spread amongst people. And so that is how that transmission route can occur. So I wanted to share with you, Janine mentioned that she helped us with some research. And so we just released this report last week called Silent Superbug Killers in a River Near You. And it's a report that we undertook some water sampling ourselves, did a study ourselves to highlight the problem of antibiotic overuse in the industrial animal agriculture system by conducting water testing near industrial pig farms in 4 countries, Canada, US, Thailand, and Spain. And the aim is to determine if the presence of antibiotic resistant genes was in animal waste discharged from industrial farms in public waterways. So what we did is we collected water and soil samples from these public rivers and streams next to industrial pig operations. We tested for 27 target antibiotic resistant genes at an accredited lab. And in Canada, we focused in Manitoba. 42 water and soil samples were collected from these waterways near 8 intensive hog operations. We focused on Manitoba because although it's the third largest pig producing province in Canada, it has the highest density of hog operations in Canada and the largest number of pigs on a single farm. In Manitoba, it's over 5,700 compared to the next largest in Quebec, which is half of that. So obviously major receptacle potentially for these antibiotic resistant bacteria and genes. So what we found in Canada is that 38 of 42 samples were positive for at least one of the tetracycline resistant genes in the analysis. And more than 3/4 of the samples were positive for 3 or more tetracycline resistant genes. And then we found positive results for resistance to antibiotics categorized as highly important or critically important to human health by the World Health Organization in the Manitoba samples, but also in samples from the other 3 countries that we investigated, Spain, Thailand, and the US. Our findings align with other similar studies that have taken place in other Canadian provinces. For example, one study demonstrated a very similar range of resistant genes from pig manure or slurry in the runoff and when crops were fertilized with this manure from the pig farm. Another found resistance to tetracyclines and found in wild animals living on or near pig farms or on pigs from the same farms. And tetracyclines are a class of antibiotics that are used quite often in the pig industry, and some of them are identified by the World Health Organization as critical or highly important. I wanted to mention too, in case people have questions about, are there any regulations in Canada with regard to this? No, there aren't, except for one that Jan mentioned, which is a veterinary prescription is now required to give any farm animals antibiotics, and that legislation passed in 2018. But other than that, antibiotics, there's no regulations around what can be given and how, and what volume. If you have a prescription, then it's open. And what also, even despite that veterinary prescription requirement, antibiotics are still given in large quantities, as indicated in this Canadian antimicrobial surveillance report that I have on the slide here. And just to give you an excerpt of what it says in the report, it said that Canada distributed or sold the 6th highest quantity of antimicrobials intended for use in animals when compared to 31 European countries. It sold 48 times more antimicrobials than the country with the lowest sales, that's Norway, and 3 times less than Cyprus, the country with the highest sales. And another report, the Canadian Council of Academies from 2019 noted, and Jan shared this stat as well, that the agriculture industry accounts for 78% of microbial use in Canada. And that's a 2016 stat. So I also wanted to mention, how much is actually, or what is the industry making any strides in this area? And again, Jan mentioned some improvements that have happened. So on the Canadian Pork Council and Chicken Farmers of Canada website, they do state what their policy is with regard to antibiotics, and that they're not, the chicken farmers in particular are vended, I think, pretty much the use of growth promotion for antibiotics. They're still used for prophylactically, but have stopped using the category 1, that's the most critical antibiotics. And they state that category 2 and 3 will no longer be permitted in the industry. On the pig industry website, it also says no, antibiotics should not or cannot be used in growth promotion, though we know that in the report, it's showing that they are still being used for that purpose, though perhaps they're phasing certain users are phasing them out, I'm not sure. And then they recommend not using the category 1 as well. So there is some progress, but there are still quite a lot of antibiotics being used in farming in Canada. And I wanted to share with you also some polling data. So we did a poll across 15 countries in 2020, asking some questions of the public about antibiotic use, and you can see that there's large support for not using antibiotics and associated issues. So overuse of antibiotics on farm animals is wrong. Concern over superbugs from farm animals is high. Antibiotics should only be used to treat sick animals. They think the government should be involved in regulating and monitoring how much antibiotics are used, and also have minimum welfare for farm animals, recognizing the connection between low welfare and high antibiotic use. And I just wanted to make a statement here, or clarify what, if in case people don't know what superbugs is. I think that the term was first coined by the media, but essentially a superbug is a bacteria that's resistant to antibiotics. So what's the global context for this issue? So the World Health Organization says that antibiotic resistance is one of the biggest threats to global health, food security, and development today. Again, Jan mentioned what the WHO has to say about this, and calls on countries to implement stronger measures to reduce the use, but also monitor antibiotic-resistant infections. In 2017, an open letter was signed by over 200 medical experts, scientists, climate change, policymakers, and others, that said industrial animal agriculture is connected to 3 what they call slow motion disasters: antibiotic resistance, climate change, and the emergence of zoonotic diseases. So a serious issue. The European Union has banned the prophylactic use of antibiotics in farm animals as of 2022. So they're not allowed to be used routinely, and they cannot be used, they state, to compensate for poor hygiene, inadequate animal husbandry, lack of care, or to compensate for poor farm management. They also say that they cannot be used prophylactically, with the exception of being used for an individual animal that's at especially high risk for an infection, So, and again, but it's an individual animal, which is different than administering them across the herd. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the role of the private sector. Most corporations now are mindful of having what they call corporate sustainable responsibility policies, depending on what sector they're working in. It could be reducing their carbon footprint or eliminating plastics from their supply chain, higher animal welfare products, and sustainable seafood. And so there are different issues that they will prioritize, but grocery retailers are one that could address this issue. And just to give a couple of examples, in the UK, the retailers here in Canada have not taken any strong policy position on phasing out the use of prophylactic antibiotics. But in the UK, Marks and Spencer, Waitrose, and Sainsbury's prohibit the routine use of antibiotics in their supply chain. And Marks and Spencer and Waitrose explicitly ban the last resort antibiotic, colistin. So I'm so glad that Jan talked about that, because that was just a nice segue into this. I didn't know what that antibiotic was, but now I know it's a really last resort one. And so they've explicitly banned the use of that in their supply chain. Another point to note is that we do have, you'll see in the supermarket shelves, products that say free from antibiotics. And that is really a niche product. Those are niche products for people that are especially concerned about antibiotic use. But that's again, it's not across, that's not necessarily what the norm is or the conventional production method is. Additionally, I'd like to point out too, is that we're not opposed to antibiotic use for sick animals. Just like with humans, animals that are sick need to be treated. It's important for their health and their welfare. We don't want them to suffer from the lack of treatment because they're going to be entering a free from label. But the antibiotic should be reserved to treat only sick animals and not be used as a preventative basis to make up for poor welfare conditions. So lastly, just some solutions and recommendations. So what we are advocating for is increased monitoring and surveillance of antibiotic use with a phase out in Canada and ban of prophylactic antibiotic use in farm animals. We'd like to see the government financially support farmers to incentivize them to adopt higher welfare farming systems so those antibiotics won't be necessary and animals can have a better quality of life. And then also reducing the consumption of animal foods in favor of more plant-based foods, not only amongst consumers and the public, but we'd like to see the government be more outspoken on this front. It aligns with our new food guide, which really emphasizes the importance of plant foods and the reduced amount of consumption of animal foods. But it also would help to meet our climate change targets and, of course, address the antibiotic resistant issue. Thank you. That's everything from me.
Thank you so much, Lynn. That was a lot of excellent information. And so now I'd like to just go to our chat, where we have a few people who seem to be feeling compelled to defend industrial livestock production. So I would rather you folks who are on the call, we don't want to hear all of your additional issues that you're bringing up. So we would just prefer to hear from people who have questions for Jan and Lynn specifically on the data that they have shared with us.
Actually,
yes,
sorry.
Go ahead, Vicki.
While I get a chance, I just want to mention a couple of things that I think are important. Regarding the use of antibiotics in the hog industry in Manitoba, there's a Canadian report, CPARS, which they only have presented their documentation up until the end of 2018. But unfortunately, although the antibiotic use in other livestock industries and other parts of Canada had decreased, in the prairie provinces, the antibiotic use in the hog industry has actually increased. So that's really a problem. And it may be related to the fact that we have such massive pig farms here, and that it's pretty hard to keep those animals healthy without using the subtherapeutic antibiotics. But I contacted the Manitoba Veterinary Medical Association to ask whether they have any policies for veterinarians given that there had been a change in the last 2 years, that hog producers are not allowed to just go to the feed store in order to get antibiotics added to the feed. Now they must have a prescription from a veterinarian. So I went to the Veterinary Association asking what were their policies about this now. And they said they have no policies, but that the veterinarian establishes a relationship with the client, and then based on that will give a prescription. So it's got to be that prescriptions are being given to whole herds of animals, not individual animals. I also contacted Manitoba Pork to ask if they had any policies, or if we. I said we wanted to learn more about what was going on in this regard, just because we don't have enough information. But I received no reply from them. So I always find that when you receive no response, it makes you even more suspicious about what's going on. Anyway, I just want to thank you, Lynn. You did it, given us tremendous information, and so has Jan. And so let's go to some of the comments and questions that other people have, as Janine has suggested.
I don't mind responding to some of the comments. I think that I think they're reasonable comments. I don't know if John Sawatsky is a farmer. I would be surprised if he is, because some of his comments, I think the information I had is from like that CPARS report, like publicly available. It's non-controversial things, and some of it does sound egregious. I agree, but it is like that own use policy. There was a policy on the books that was a farmer could order antibiotics from anywhere they want, use it on their farm without telling anybody, and that continued despite doctors saying, please stop this. That we need at least get a veterinarian to sign off on the antibiotic. And that has closed. It took time, but I think people are understanding that we have to kind of monitor this for all of us. In hospital, we have to do that everywhere. We have to really take this seriously, and everybody has to work together for it. Another one, he mentioned that antibiotics are not used all the time and things, and that's true. And as Lynn pointed out, what we're asking for is antibiotics not to be used for things that are unnecessary, like growth promotion or disease prevention, if possible. And I think that the challenge is we have huge farms. It's difficult to treat an individual animal. But I think what Lynn is saying, well, then maybe don't do that. If you can't do it without using this practice, it might be best to not do that. And that slide from CPARS, that report, we only have 97 farms, so it's not all farms, but the antibiotics that were reported to be used on that farm were all used for kind of growth promotion or growth prevention, not for therapeutic use. And it's I think that's where people are asking. They're saying that even for us, if to use antibiotics in hospitals and things, we're trying to use it. Do you have an infection? If it's just a cold, cough, things like this, better not to use it. If you have a real infection, go for it and use it. And so I think those are some of the points to make for those things.
Right. And I'd just like to point out that the statistics on the increase in antibiotic use prophylactically in Manitoba is from 2018. Someone was asking when our stats were from, and the statistics in the CPARS report is from 2018. And it shows antibiotic use going down in all provinces except the prairie provinces and the pork production. And yes, all animals have to be, there's a withdrawal time that if antibiotics are administered to animals, there has to be a period of time for which they don't receive the antibiotics prior to being put on the market. And that is monitored by CFIA. That's correct information. However, during the lifetime of that animal, they might have had many be consistently fed on antibiotic-laced feed if it's not organic. In organic, you cannot withhold treatment of an animal. If it needs antibiotics, you have to give it. But the whole certification that happens every year is geared to ensuring that the system respects the animal's well-being and the workers' well-being, so that it is a more resilient, long-term sustainable system. And that's what we're striving for in our food production, is systems that promote health and enrich everyone involved in the production, as well as the soil and the environment, as opposed to short-term profit. And these, with the average hog barn in Manitoba having over 5,000 animals, most of them on the slurry pit system, where the animals are on the slatted floor over a big lagoon that may be pumped to an outside lagoon, but still the smells in the barn are such high levels, and pigs' lungs are as sensitive as ours, and very few workers have to be protected to go in there because the hydrogen sulfide levels are so high. And this is one of the main reasons why antibiotic use is so high in Manitoba, is because the method of production that's being used, where the animals have to be on these flat floors, which are very stressed. Remember, these animals have pronged hooves. So being on a flat floor is very stress inducing for them. And so this stress also, it's cruel, and it also causes them to be less healthy. So in order for them to grow to meet the production quotas, they pump the feed full of this antibiotics, which tests are showing is on the meat in the stores. It's in the factory workers that work there. And from the testing that I just did, I'm a trained sampler. Organic inspection requires sampling in cases where there's a contamination. And so I conducted this sampling, meeting all standard protocols in the ditches outside of the 8 barns. And I just randomly chose 8 barns within a 10-mile radius of my farm. And followed all the sampling protocols. And as Lynn said, many of them had 3 different variants of genetically of antibiotic or antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So all 8 barns, and there were the samples were all some with 3 different strains. So it's a scary situation, and we need to educate ourselves and educate each other. And please remember that we're volunteers here. Our motivation is only for the public good and for the well-being of the animals, because having been raised, antibiotic resistant genes, right? Not bacteria itself. So the genetics was there in the samples, showing that it can lead to bacteria being produced. All right.
I just wanted to add something to that, to what you were saying, Janine, around that there's the withdrawal period, but the antibiotics can get into, or the resistant genes can get into the environment. It's not just through the food supply, right? As I was saying it through, and as we know from the sampling and the other studies that have been done, is through the waterways and spreading on crops, etc. So even with that withdrawal period, some of them could have already made their way into the environment. And in pig production, oftentimes they're given at their start of their life, when they're weaned and subjected to these procedures, when there's a high risk of infection. So it's already happened, and it's already making its way through that slurry system. I also wanted to respond to a comment in the chat by Adrian, I think, who said around the population growth as really facilitated or is the reason for this growth in industrial animal agriculture. Absolutely, that's true. That's a piece of it, but I think the bigger piece is the high demand for animal protein, the high consumption of animal foods. And that has really propelled this issue forward. And this is why all the expert bodies are saying that we cannot continue to consume animal foods at the current level. The earth does not have the capacity. The amount of land that goes into using not just animals to graze, but to grow the feed crops. This is why they're talking about biodiversity loss and habitat loss, because of the land that's taken away and used for feed crops to feed animals. And the resources, the water resources, the fertilizers, and then of course the impacts at the other side, the greenhouse gas emissions, etc. And the only answer really is to reduce that animal consumption. And World Animal Protection doesn't advocate a vegan or vegetarian diet necessarily. Like, if people want to adopt that, and there will be those that do or have for all these various reasons, whether it be environment, animal welfare, health, whatever. But certainly if people were to reduce the consumption of animal foods by 50%, globally would have a huge impact, positive impact, net benefit. And, you know, this isn't fringe thinking anymore. This isn't, we have, you know, UNEP, the International Panel on Climate Change. We have Chatham House, the report that I said. We have Pew Commission in the US, the Planetary Health Diet. So it's, and there's if anyone's interested, there's a great organization in the US called the 50 by 40 Coalition, advocating, many different types of organizations have signed on, advocating for 50% reduction in animal foods by 2040. Again, it's necessary for our survival, and I don't mean to sound alarmist, but it's true.
Okay, thanks, Lynn. I just want to jump in and say that we actually still have a few family farms and some organic farms here where pigs are raised without antibiotics. So I want everybody to understand that if we're raising pigs in smaller numbers, in circumstances that meet their needs, allowing them to have straw and some room to move around, they don't need to have these antibiotics all the time. It's confining them with thousands under one roof in completely unnatural circumstances that simply can't carry on. And now, Jan, I'm sorry, I think you had something to say.
No, that was a good point. I think that was a good point. I think that's a good point. And that it's not, you know, there are other countries too, and say, I think you mentioned that someone might be coming on from Denmark, and other countries have taken this more proactively than Canada in limiting the antibiotic use for healthy animals to prevent infections on farms. And I think that but it's a cost thing. And I think that these things are cheap. You know, when the CFTO, for example, that's less than 1 cent per chicken. Like the amount of antibiotic is quite cheap. It's in the feed. It's really, it's not the drug that we get from Pfizer or something. It's it's cost effective. And I think that's led to some of the reluctance in adopting some of these new standards. And so I think it is important to push and to say that we need both voices. We need industry and for-profit voices, efficiency, all that kind of stuff, but we also need kind of public health protections and limiting the withdrawal of the antibiotic. That's great, but you know, I'm really worried about the antibiotic use during the time that animal's alive, because then we've seen clear evidence that bacteria become resistant. It selects for those mutants, then those mutants will become more common in those animals, and then those bacteria don't just stay on the farm, and they come to us. They come to us through the meat, and a lot of the sampling we're doing, because of limited sampling on limiting access to sampling on farms, we're doing on meat samples in the stores, and we do see that those meat samples on stores have E. coli, salmonella on them, and that those resistances are high. And that's non-controversial data. That's known, and that's why people say cook your food well so you don't get salmonella from the food. But as well as salmonella, you can get other bacteria like these E. coli that lead to other infections that we get. A common one would be urinary tract infection.
Thank you, Jan. That's important. Just to address some of the other conversations on the chat, it's estimated that between 3 and 5% of the pork production in Canada stays in Canada, so that would be between 97 and 95%, specifically for Manitoba. Of the Manitoba pork production is exported for profit, private profit by these companies, many of them owned by people outside of the province. But 100% of the manure stays here. And the manure is not being composted. It's not being, because when a previous government mandated that the liquid be separated from the solid for composting, then that served as a moratorium on the industry that lasted for quite some time, until recently, when the current government lifted that requirement. And that's why we're seeing an expansion of the hog industry again in Manitoba, is because the requirement for more resilient management of the manure was not being met, and the operators, one operator specifically, a neighbor of mine, who I review in my work manure management plans all the time. And so I offered to do for free for him a manure management plan for him to compost his manure rather than clear cut more forest for application, because there's a lot of swamp forest in this part of La Broquerie and Hanover where there's there's a lot of rock and swamp forest that absorbs the water, and they're bulldozing it to let the quackgrass grow to apply hog manure to meet the phosphorus application regulation rules. So they're not, the government is not enforcing that, because as a verification officer, I see people doing things that I know do not meet the manure and mortality management regulations. But unfortunately, our current government does not have the political will to enforce the manure management recommendations that are on the books. They're regulations, not recommendations, but they're not being enforced. And so we are seeing an increasing hog production in Manitoba and the public is left to deal with the problems that it's causing. And our other seminars will be looking at the impacts of the hog industry. Not only this one is on antibiotic resistance and our health, but also on Lake Winnipeg and on their neighbors, such as myself, and we'll have others who are on the call who will be speaking to the impacts that it's had on them. So just wanted to address that. So yes, the production for pork in Manitoba is not for Canadian use. Most of it is for sale outside, and that is documented. That is clearly, I know there's someone arguing on this post, but that reference can easily be made.
And I just want to jump in now and say that this week I've been speaking to someone who's concerned about a couple of proposed barns in their area. And these barns are being proposed by a company from Denmark, Top Pig. And the thing is that in Denmark, they have much more stringent environmental regulations than we have here in Manitoba. One example is related to odor from barns. In Denmark, apparently they have to have something called air scrubbers, so that neighbors of barns are not going to have to endure some of the noxious odors that people here living close to hog barns are subjected to. So doesn't it seem clear that if people from other countries are coming to Manitoba because we have laxer environmental regulations, surely us Manitobans should be concerned about what that means for our environment. So these are very big issues, and in Manitoba, the hog industry is a very big power, but we really need to encourage and push and do whatever we can to move things into a much more sustainable way of raising pigs, because what's currently happening just is creating far too many problems.
I'm really glad you mentioned what's happening in Denmark, Vicki, because I just like folks on the call to know that in Denmark, and I think in Canada, we have like 1.3% of our agriculture is organic. In Denmark, it's closer to 8%. And in Denmark, all of the organic certification costs are covered by a tax on pesticides. So the Danish government taxes pesticides, which they want to discourage use, and they use that money to fund organic certification so more and more pigs can be raised organically. And when an animal is raised organically, it has to go outside. It has to get the exercise. It has to see the sunshine. It has to have some pasture, or for pigs, its rooting area, so they can, in fact, express their natural animal behaviors. Because that's part of the cruelty of this industrial system, is pigs have a snout and they want to nest in straw, they want to root, that's in their DNA. And when you deny an animal its basic expression of its genetic predispositions, that causes a great deal of stress. So I just wanted to say, if there's a will, but the people have to insist that their governments attend to this. So that's why, we have to make governments accountable to the populace. And I'm afraid the Manitoba population has been we've really sat back and we've trusted that the government's doing the right thing. But in terms of allowing this animal production to grow to such huge levels, over 5,000 hogs per barn, that's just not sustainable. And it's so hard on the environment, not to mention how hard it is on the workers and the torture, the absolute torture that the pigs go through.
I'll just, Janine has referred to this, but I'll just remind everybody that we have 2 more webinars coming up in the next 2 weeks. Next week, it's about living near these factory hog barns, and we will hear from several people who have got personal experience to talk about. But we also are really pleased that we're going to hear from a family farm who is raising pigs the way that we hope we can encourage many people to move back to in some ways the old-fashioned ways, although I don't really want to call it old-fashioned. But we'll be ending that webinar on a positive note, and then so that's next Wednesday, April 21st at 7 o'clock. And the link that you received tonight for this Zoom will also be good for next week's webinar. And then 2 weeks from tonight, on April 28th, it's about the connection between the growth of the hog industry in Manitoba and what's happening in Lake Winnipeg and many of our prairie lakes with too much blue-green algae, some of which is toxic. So I'll be explaining a lot more about that because that's something I've done a lot of research about over the past 15 years. And we'll also be hearing from someone who's lived around the lake for over 60 years and from an Indigenous elder who can talk about their perspective. So we've got 2 more webinars coming up, and we hope that many of you will join us on those. And feel free to pass the information on to other people who you think might possibly be interested. In the meantime, are there any final questions to our 2 speakers?
I will just respond to one of the comments on the system, on the chat rather, and that yes, live animals are exported from Manitoba. Weanlings are sent regularly to the US to be raised, and animals for slaughter, live animals for slaughter, are sent to Japan, are sent around the world. And it just doesn't make any sense, because it's so stressful for animals so that all humane systems recommend the animals be slaughtered on the farm. And the highest level of humane systems say that the animal never has to leave its environment, so that it's not that it only has one bad day, that its whole life is good, but it only has one bad moment. But we need to reduce our consumption of livestock, of meat, and our production of livestock, not only for environmental health locally around the barns and for to reduce antimicrobial resistance in bacteria, but also to just to be healthier in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And, so there are very many reasons. And I think both Lynn and Jan did an excellent job in presenting concerns on that. So Lynn, did you have something you wanted to share? I thought I saw you briefly comment there, but I'd like to focus on our
no, I was just responding to some of the conversations in the chat around, indoor, outdoor systems, etc., and emphasizing that higher welfare. Pigs in in a really cold climate can be kept. I've seen systems where animals are kept in deeply bedded straw indoor systems with access to outdoor only when it's the temperature is appropriate. And it helps with the odor too. Like the straw obviously helps with the odor, even if I imagine if it's a sizable farm, but they're still have these deeply bedded straw systems and the animals have space to move around, you wouldn't get the same level of odor, and the result is all. And I think Bill's going to talk about this. I imagine that the straw is compostable, so you don't have the slurry systems. Just there's so many benefits to higher welfare, like the public health. No studies have shown that not tail docking and castration has farmers in, it might have been Denmark, someone mentioned Denmark, I can't remember where I read, or Europe, somewhere in Europe, where they don't do these things, and then it doesn't it reduces the need for antibiotics. So many different improvements to the housing or husbandry can have huge benefits for both the animals, but also environment and health, public health.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you,
I just
Lynn.
wondered, did you have any final comment for us tonight?
No, maybe just one. The comments are good. I think it's nice to have discussion, so I like that. I just wanted maybe to respond to the one about the plants that eating plant protein or animal protein. I think that's that both are healthy sources of protein. I think, and there's risk. There's cultural things and all kinds of considerations in what we eat. But I think someone mentioned the Health Canada guidelines and things, and there's a general push to eat more plant-based proteins, that there is some evidence that they may be healthier for us, and there are some benefits too for the planet. So plant-based proteins are a healthy source of nutrition. You don't necessarily, I don't think there's evidence that animal protein is better than a plant protein. We just have to have good, healthy, balanced diets, and to reducible harms makes sense. So if that's with antibiotic use on farms, I think those are good to address.
Thank you, Jan. I do have to add that I sincerely believe if most Canadians knew the conditions under which pigs and piglets and weanlings and hogs are being raised in Canada, they would boycott the pork production, because that was it's just the conditions in these intensive livestock operations are just so hideous that's why they've started using these high levels of antibiotics in the feed, is because they just don't do well in those conditions. So we have to change the way we're producing food in Canada, and that's not strictly just the livestock production either, the meat production. We have to get away from synthetic chemicals in crop production as well. So how your plant-based proteins are produced, that's important to be aware of as well.
And I think that you're right, and I think that may be why I've heard there's an animal egg gag, or there's more gag things that people, I think the industry recognizes that some of those things people are taken aback by some of the things that happen on farms, and they don't always want to support those kinds of things. And so I think that some of the egg gag legislation is kind of a reaction to that in order to I think limit the amount of public attention to some of the practices that have both infectious disease concerns and animal welfare concerns as well.
Which to me seems completely backwards. Instead of dealing with the problem, they're trying to silence the whistleblowers.
But people don't like to hear about it either. I think we don't want to hear. Like, we want to eat the meat and not hear. Don't tell me this bad news. Don't tell me that it's contributing to climate change, that it's giving me antibiotic resistant organisms, that we're hurting the animals. We kind of don't want to hear about that. So, so I think it's important to hear about it and be informed and make critical decisions for ourselves.
I just want to jump in and respond to a comment that somebody has made about wondering whether Hogwatch has done a survey on how many pigs are being raised without antibiotics. No, we haven't done that kind of a survey, but I do know that there are some products that are being sold as being raised without antibiotics, and they're in very high demand. I know occasionally, I don't buy very much meat, but occasionally I have, and I always look for those products. And often they're sold out. So it tells me that there probably is a greater market for that than what the supply can meet right now. Anyway,
I have to agree with that, Vicki. Of the producers, there are many organic livestock producers in Manitoba who are no longer certified organic because they don't need the certification. Certification is when you sell, but because they can sell everything they produce at farm gate to their neighbors. There's such a difference in the taste. I've had people tell me when they cook pork, that they buy in the store, it smells like the barn. Whereas when they go to Zinn Family Farms, or, my neighbors, Jerry and Kelly Dubé, or any number of Friggs Meats, and they buy a meat that has been raised humanely with outdoor access in the more traditional methods, that it smells and tastes so wonderful, and it reminds them of their childhood. And so that on the small scale, that's still happening. So for those of you that do want to continue to support, boycott the pork in the stores, because unless it's marked humanely raised, it's going to have come from one of these confinement systems, or deal directly with the farmers. And next week, you'll be able to meet Andreas Zinn from Zinn Family Farms. So, all right. There's Brent on the call supporting more resilient agriculture. So that's just, we want regenerative, resilient agriculture where we're leaving the environment a better place than for our grandchildren. And that's not what's happening right now with this growing more antibiotic resistant bacteria and the clear cutting of the lands. I mean, it just breaks my heart around where I live. There's so much clear cutting for the spreading of manure for these industrial barns. That's the opposite of what we need to be doing. So I really support all of you to take a look at your consumption patterns as we have and we do, and support the kind of agriculture and the kind of the kind of family farms that you want to see. And that's not this industrial model. And unfortunately, it is provincial and federal policies that have caused the change. In the 1970s, we had almost 2,000 pork producers in Manitoba. And the most recent stats show we have only 700 pork producers in Manitoba. So we've drastically reduced the number, but the amount has increased a great deal. Thanks. I'm just saying I'm not going to respond to John Zawatsky. He doesn't, he's just saying everything that we're sharing is false, and that's not true. Everything we're sharing is referenced. We're volunteers. We have no financial stake in this. It's very different than the Pork Council and the Manitoba government, who do get supported by the industry. They have something to lose. We are just interested in supporting the public good and the animal welfare. That's our main motivation.
Actually, I'm just going to say one final thing here, and then I think we're probably coming to a conclusion. But regarding the issue of whether the meat from pigs raised in factory farms tastes any different, a number of years ago, Janine was involved with me while I was at the Winnipeg Humane Society. Together, we were promoting something called Humane Certified Pork. We were trying to provide an alternative for the public who wanted to eat pork, but who wanted to support humanely raised pigs. Anyway, at the press conference that we held to actually announce this program, one of the reporters absolutely shocked me by saying, will this meat taste any different from the pork that I buy at the store? Because lately when I've been cooking it, it just smells awful. It smells like urine. And I didn't know what to answer. I was so shocked at that, to be quite honest. So I know that that's not a scientific thing, but it really is a true story. Janine was there. She can agree with me. And that came from, somebody who was a reporter with Winnipeg Free Press, actually. So anyway, I honestly have not eaten pork for quite a while myself, so I can't make any comment about this. So I'll just put in my comment right now that I want to thank Jan and Lynn for providing us with really excellent information and very thought-provoking, helpful. And I want to thank everybody else who's joined, because this is an important issue. We want to hear from everybody. And I hope that you'll consider joining us over the next 2 weeks. And thank you, Janine, for doing such a great job of actually getting us going and keeping us organized and so on. I really appreciate that. We're a good team, aren't we?
We are a team, and thank you to Vicki for the financial support for these webinars, and to all of those that have made donations to Manitoba Hogwatch. I would like to direct you to our website. The website is, a link is on the chat. Please do, let's continue the discussion there, but we would welcome your donations for the costs of these webinars. We really felt that we needed to promote this important information that more Manitobans need to know, and hopefully we'll be able to support a change in agriculture. Manitoba is a very agricultural province, but we need to be more diversified. For example, there's a $25 million a year organic pork sector in Quebec, because the Quebec government learned that there were problems in the industrial model, and so they've been encouraging small scale. Dubreton is the company. You can contact Dubreton in Quebec that do the work to support organic production, and the demand is very high because people do want to show their values through how they spend their money. So those of you that have enjoyed tonight's webinar, please do consider making a donation. Please visit our website and direct others that you think share these values to become members of Hogwatch. We're a membership organization where we just welcome people to come, and we support one another in trying to support a more resilient and fair hog industry in Manitoba for the benefit of our children and grandchildren. So thank you for all. I hope our speakers have seen the many positive comments and the many thank yous that are coming in. Some people may be accusing us of lying, but we're not. We have no vested interest. This is just all publicly available, and we don't share anything that's not verifiable. And the information that we put on our website all will be referenced. We're just concerned about public health, environmental health, and the well-being of the animals. So thank you to our presenters tonight, and thank you to all of you for joining, and hopefully you will be able to join us again next Wednesday, same time, 7 p.m., same link. So thank
you. And
Bye now.
Bye, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in.
Bye.
Thanks again.